Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the Sid Ammar 316 podcast. It's Thursday, August 10, 2023. And yes, this is a new endeavor I'm taking part in. Um, my first guest is Nadia Kantar, hailing from New York City. She is a 27-year-old Lebanese American woman born and raised in the United States with a very interesting life experience, which she may share tidbits with us today. Nadia has a bachelor's degree from New York University, a global liberal studies degree with a concentration in politics, human rights, and development. Nadia is also currently studying law. I invited Nadia to be on here today on the first episode as we have similar shared interests in today's topic, which is essentially how to maintain traditional values in a world that is growing increasingly hostile to tradition. So without further ado, please go ahead and share anything you like, Nadia.
Thank you for having me on your first show, Sid. I'm really excited that you're starting this podcast, and I can't wait to see how it grows. And I know it's going to be very successful. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so
Um,
much, Nadia.
I graduated from NYU in 2018. I took about a year off just to get into the workforce. I worked at a law firm, and then I worked at two different debt consolidation companies, debt settlement companies. One before the pandemic, one right after the pandemic, as we were coming out of it. And now I'm in law school. And I am Lebanese American. I grew up pretty traditional. I grew up in New York City, which is as cosmopolitan as it gets. So it was kind of like you grew up in the melting pot, but you were told from a very young age what you were. So you had to be a part of the melting pot without, you know, essentially losing your identity. So that was interesting. But
You've
I
been
think
in New York. You've been in New York City your entire life.
my entire life grew up in a New York City apartment. Typical immigrant story, it's like the ones you read about. My family didn't come from Ellis Island, like they came after the fact, but it was a typical story. We grew up in an apartment. We had the whole family there. My cousins will tell you about six people in a room, kind of a thing. Like that's the way that we grew up in the very typical immigrant style. So yeah, I've
It,
been here my whole life.
it's very interesting because New York City is kind of like it's a cosmopolitan mix. It's a reflection of the United States, what the United States is becoming as a whole, and it's known as a very liberal city.
Yeah.
New York City, California, and other areas in the United States, and in stark contrast to somewhere like Florida or Texas.
Yeah. Yeah. So Florida is actually where I did my first year of law school. It was a culture shock. And I ended up in Florida, just to give you some background information on that. I ended up in Florida because during the COVID pandemic, there were some strict COVID regulations for the law school that I got into. And I had a religious exemption letter for the vaccine. I'm not vaccinated and I refused to get vaccinated. And
Good for you.
thank you. And I wasn't allowed to attend, so I picked myself up in 3 days. I was in Florida, and I did my first class there, my first year there. But
Wow.
I'm back now, and the restrictions have been lifted for now, and hopefully for good. But yeah,
So
I mean,
speaking of traditional values, because of what you believed in, which is a traditional, I'd say a conservative value, no one has the right to tell you, especially the government has no right to tell you, hey, or a private institution, you must inject yourself with so and so.
yeah, I didn't even see it as a traditional value in the sense of my Lebanese background. I saw it as an American value. It's an American traditional value to say, the government needs to back off. So I figured that was
That's what I mean.
that wasn't me, tapping into my identity as Lebanese American. That was fully an American an American choice I made there. But yeah, I mean, your question was about Western civilization, and I think that's a good segue into it because Western values, I think, are something that are being slowly eroded, and I think everybody's seeing that happening. But I think it's important to get to the root of what Western civilization is, how it developed, before we even dive into that. So I do want to speak on that a little bit if you're willing. And I
Yeah,
think
absolutely. That's totally fine. You see, it's interesting that you bring up the roots of Western civilization because modern society today, and it seems like some people or some segments of society don't have a good understanding of this, but modern society today in the West, most Western countries, Western governments, they're based on there are roots to the civilization that we've created in the West. There are biblical values. I mean, there are strong biblical values, but what about the values that the Greek philosophers gave us? There are strong Greek values. There is even some Islamic influence.
Yeah.
So I know that's important. And yeah, please go ahead.
I think, you know, you said something very interesting because there are a lot of people who don't know about it, and there are people who don't want them to know about it. The fact of the matter is, if you meet anybody, you see those videos that they do with like YouTube when they ask people like how many states does the United States have, and you have people say something like 40, and then you have somebody else say 62. It goes beyond that. I mean, there's a reason why we're not told that our roots are biblical, is because we're growing increasingly secular, and if we give any credit to religion, that goes counter to the culture. But
Or those videos in which they ask these girls how many can you name 3 countries,
yeah.
and they name like a continent or something. I'm like, what's going on? Because when I was in school in the 90s, everyone, boys and girls, we all learned geography. Like, I
Mhm.
don't know what's up with the modern culture today, but people don't know the names of 3 countries anymore.
People are easier to control when they're not told their history, and they're not told their geography, and they're not told, you know, they're not educated or knowledgeable about things that'll give them the ability to think critically. But just to circle back to well, the reason why I mentioned religion, you know, you mentioned Greek philosophy and I mentioned religion, is because a lot of religion, specifically, you know, if you look into the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, a lot of them take from or share certain aspects of Greek philosophy. So just to dive into like the origins of Western civilization, I think Greece is a good place to start. I mean, there's evidence that there's civilizations that predate ancient Greece as well, but for the most part, you know, most academics recognize Greece as like the cradle of Western civilization for a reason. And I think you can start with, you know, for me, when I think of ancient Greece, I think of Greek tragedies and I think of hubris. Are you familiar with that concept?
And go ahead, explain it.
So hubris is it's a concept of excessive pride or overconfidence in oneself. It's the story of Icarus, the guy who flew too close to the sun, and he had these wax wings and they melted off and he fell. So it's the idea that the Greeks were warning us from the very beginning: when man becomes too full of himself, he's going to crash and burn. It's very similar to you know, the Titanic captures our imagination because it's a modern day Greek tragedy. It's a story of hubris. Man himself can't sink God himself can't sink the ship, right? But God did sink the ship. So it's the idea that no matter how big we think we are, we're in the grand scheme of things, there's something always bigger than us. And Greek philosophy is rooted in that concept. It's this idea of humility and humble yourself. It's a vice, a virtue that Aristotle would often speak about. The excess of, for example, courage, right? So you have this concept of virtue and vice, everything in extreme. You have courage on one side, and then you have cowardice on the other. I'm sorry, rather, it's courage is in the middle, cowardice is on one side, and the other, the extremity, the opposite of courage is recklessness. So you can be you can either be a coward or you can be reckless, right?
Yeah.
So
The example you used, though, I want to mention with Icarus. You're saying he had wax wings. I don't know much about Icarus, but the idea is you're saying he flew too close to the sun and he melted his wings.
yes.
There's another saying. I don't know the origin of the saying, but it's like when it comes to the truth. You know, let's say the truth about God. It's like you cannot learn everything and attain all the knowledge at once. So you got to view the truth as a concept. Like, if you're too far away from the sun, it's too cold, you're not in possession of any of the truth. But
Mm.
if you're too close to the sun and you're not ready for it, you will melt, you will
Yeah.
burn up, you will melt. So you have to be balanced. You have to be somewhere in the middle, slowly, gradually opening your eyes up. You can't just live in darkness in your entire life and then randomly one day open up your eyes and stare into the sun. You're going to go blind.
Yeah.
So the entire truth cannot be exposed to you at one time in one sitting. It's gradual. It takes eons, actually. It
Yeah.
takes a
And
very long time to understand and to learn a new concept and to understand greater and greater truths.
yeah, and that's the concept that Aristotle was trying to explain, is this idea that we have to be balanced between our virtues and our vices. So just so I can elaborate a little more, because I don't think I explained it clearly. Aristotle saw that the ideal person is somebody who's in balance of virtue and vice. So virtue is the trait that's desirable. Vice is the trait that, you know, you want to stay away from. So just to use the example again, courage is the one that I use. You have recklessness on one side, and then you have cowardice on the other, right? And these are two extremes. You're either extremely so confident that you're doing stupid things, or you're so afraid that you're a coward. But courage, which is a vice, is what you want, is that sweet spot in the middle where you use discernment to say, okay, this is something that I don't want to partake in. It's not worth it. It's reckless. And but also the ability to say, if I don't stand up, I'm a coward. So
You
it's
want to
that
be balanced.
you want to be balanced. And I think Western civilization has always pushed for that. It's pushed for like a kind of a balance in understanding the world, to not go into philosophical extremities. And when we do, you know, I mean, we always end up in trouble. And I say we, as a Westerner, I also, somebody, I consider myself an Easterner as well. But when I say we, I'm referring to the West right now. When you go into extremities, you're always in trouble. I mean, look at the Catholic Church. Their ideals have a lot of great virtues. If you actually read the tenets, a lot of good things have come from Catholicism. The concept of human rights, for example, if you look into history, can be attributed to the Catholic Church. Ironically, a lot of people, you know, it gets a lot of people will go into the atrocities that were committed at the hands of the church, but those atrocities led to the concept of human rights, believe it or not. And I
What
can get into
what about the Magna Carta?
the Magna Carta was more of a political reformation rather than philosophical human rights. I mean, I could see that being an argument, but what I'm referring to specifically is, for example, Bartolomé de las Casas. So Bartolomé de las Casas was a Catholic priest in the New World at the time. I believe he was, I'm not sure if he was in, he wasn't in Cuba because there was another priest who was in Cuba. His name was Antonio something or Andrea something. But Bartolomé de las Casas was in South America, and he wrote to the Catholic, the Pope, and he said he essentially wrote that the way we're treating the natives is atrocious because they clearly have souls, and because they have souls, an injustice upon them is an injustice upon God. Therefore, what we're doing is wrong. Because all you need to do, and this is how humans have always justified any kind of atrocity, is to make the person that you're subjugating not human. You know, the idea, well, slaves aren't humans, right? That's something that it justifies atrocity. So Bartolomé de las Casas comes around and he essentially says, you know, they have souls, the idea of created in the image of God. Therefore, they have human rights. And that's where we really see the first concept of human rights come from. But what I was getting at, just to circle back once more, the concept of extremities. We can't live in extremes. The Catholic Church at the time, I used them as an example, was an extreme. For example, the Inquisition, that was an extreme. But Aristotle told us and told man, and we use the word to refer to mankind, not just in our politically correct culture. We have to emphasize that includes women too. The idea is you have to be balanced. So Western civilization was kind of founded on that, really, but we lost that along the way, I think. We've swung the pendulum. We've either gone extremely, I guess, medieval, but now we're going extremely secular post-enlightenment, and that's the world we're living in now. But
you know, everyone 50 years ago, 100 years ago, all throughout human history, every single person that's ever used the word mankind knew it referred to men and women.
Yeah, I mean, it's we got to be very specific these days. I don't know how we're going to do it with gendered languages. Arabic is very gendered. So until these philosophies hit the Middle East, it's going to stay that way until somebody decides, you know, we got to be more specific. They're trying to do it with Spanish. I speak Spanish too. They're trying to make Spanish more, you know, inclusive by making it so that, you know, you refer to terms so that emphasizes the different, like, for example, in Spanish, if you have 100 women in a room but one man, you use the masculine term.
Same thing in there. Oh yeah.
Arabic,
If it's all women, right?
Yeah, if it's all women, you use the feminine term.
Yes.
But if there's just
in Arabic, it's like that too. But if there are
Exactly.
if there are a mix of men and women in a room, in Arabic, you use the masculine. You address
You use
with
the
masculine. Yeah.
You just need one man and it becomes masculine.
Yeah.
So
it's just
so
the
I'd be
nature of the
interested
language.
so I'd be interested to see how, you know, this philosophy would translate to languages like that. I know they're trying to do it in Spanish, but when I say man, I'm referring to mankind, and that includes women.
Yeah, of course.
I'm a woman, so I'm not here just speaking for just men. But yeah. So Western civilization, I think Greek philosophy had a lot of
Wait,
concepts.
just to mention this, you're mentioning, in your example, what they have souls too. I mean, you can take it all the way to the U.S. Constitution, in which it says all men are created equal. I
Right.
mean, that idea is rooted right there in the founding of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was John Adams who said that the Constitution was written for a religious people. He said it's not adequate for any other. So the idea is once the culture is no longer religious, Constitution is no longer going to be functional because you have to have a cultural foundation and some kind of tradition.
That's
But
very
what
important that you mentioned that, Nadia, because everyone's talking about separation of church and state, and the way the U.S. system is set up, it's set up so that way. I mean, you cannot have forced Christianity on everyone. So they put
right.
safeguards in place. But
Yeah.
as you're saying, John Adams still said this is created for a religious people.
Yeah. What's really interesting about separation of church and state is everybody hears that and they use it to justify, the idea that religion needs to back off government. But it
But
goes
you
both
can't
ways.
you can't
It
back
goes
it
both
off
ways.
100%. It's rooted like the very values.
Yes.
The
It's
Ten
more than that.
Commandments.
It's more than that. It's
The
the
Ten
government.
Commandments, are they
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
rooted in the modern law that you study? Or
Yes. Of
is
course.
not the basis of modern law goes
Yes.
back to the Ten Commandments?
Yeah. Or it's the Christian, and some people use the term Judeo-Christian. It's the Judeo-Christian notion of morality, which basically outlines the legal field, or has historically. That's changing a little bit now, but not enough so that it's rooted the foundation. Not yet, and hopefully not ever. But um, the 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 Ten Commandments that you were mentioning, there's some people, a lot of people who'll be listening to this will say, well, it predates, right? It predates the Christianity, it predates Judaism. But that just goes to show that the concept of morality was always something that humans have been grappling with. And law is just man's way to try to legislate that. But the separation of church and state, you see, a lot of people automatically think it protects them from religion. In reality, it's supposed to protect religion from the government. It goes both ways. It's the idea that separation of church and state, the state is not the one who's going to tell you how to practice your religion either. It goes both ways, but nobody ever discusses it in both ways. They only discuss it when a religious person or a Christian specifically starts giving their opinion. All of a sudden, separation of church and state. But when the state is deciding, how to behave in a specific way that's counter to religious groups, nobody says a peep about separation of church and state.
But would you say that the values in which these Western governments were founded upon, I mean, in Canada, the Constitution clearly refers to, quote, supremacy of God. In the United States, same thing as well.
Yeah.
And not that exact statement, but it refers to God, does it not?
It does.
So if it's referring to God, there is a theological basis, there is a religious basis. You know what I mean? So how can people today want to completely separate religion 100% from our governing structures when our governing structures, I mean, people are coming here because this is the land of the free. All this immigration, everybody's coming into the West. Well, why are they coming into the West? They're coming into the West because of the values that the West was founded upon: freedom and equality, etc., so on and so forth. Is it not?
I want to read to you just the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, because I think a lot of people forget the foundation of what the philosophy was that sparked this movement. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. See, this is the thing: is we can't have a government that's totally separate from a belief in a superior being. It's not possible. And if you're gonna have that kind of a government, you're revolutionizing the American government. America was never meant to be secular in the sense that it doesn't believe in a God. It was meant to be non-intrusive for religious people. That's what the government was supposed to be. It was set up, like John Adams said, for religious people, with the government knowing its limits about what it can and cannot do for that people. It was never meant to be, we're going to be an atheist state. That's that was Soviet Russia. That's China. It's not the United States, and never was. and this misinformation that's going around that's telling people, you know, we're supposed to be the secular country. It's just not true. And it's not historically sound, and it's not founded in philosophical it's not founded in any kind of philosophical reasoning, because once you get rid of the foundation, you're rewriting the books completely. And I think the concept of human rights, as I said, I've had this conversation with many non-believers and non-theists and atheists, is this idea that human rights is a concept that is founded on the belief that there is an ultimate authority, because otherwise it's just you and me who's the authority, right? And if
otherwise it becomes relative. That's the thing.
Becomes relative.
You don't believe in a creator, so the rights are absolute. So, you know, you and I both come from, you know, a religious background. You know, we happen to be Druze, you know, Westerners. I'm Canadian, you're American, but these values are based in religion. So if we move to a society that is governed, you know, in a relative sense, our values are going to be relative. So because we believe in God, rights are absolute, because it's very simple. You have, you know, thou shalt not kill, you know, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not A, B, C, D, F, G. I mean, they're set in stone laws and rules. Now, if you take everything to the relative, all of a sudden it's humanity, not a superior authority. It's humanity that is setting the guidelines, and these guidelines can change from generation to generation to generation. And with today, with postmodernism, the deconstruction of all things, one can argue, okay, if you deconstruct everything, what are your values? What are your values based on? You cannot latch your values onto anything, because the understanding of everything is always changing, and it's going to keep going this way unless there is a pushback. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I hear you completely. I think what's really interesting though is you always hear this argument from non-theists. You hear it all the time, is this idea of like, well, if the only thing stopping you from killing somebody is because God said it, then, you know, you're a murderer, like you want to kill somebody. I've heard that before. I've heard arguments about like, you don't need a book to tell you what's right or wrong, you just know. And I find that to be so foolish, because no, you don't just know. We have the luxury of living in a post-Christian world, or rather a world that's coming out of like a world that's been influenced by Christianity. We have the luxury of having Christian values as a given. We don't think twice about them. We don't think twice about thou shalt not kill. To us, it's obvious. But if you look at history, it was not that obvious. It's never been obvious. And
you see what happens, like you see what happens when we slowly remove God. I mean, these excuses that people use, and they say, well, you can't just believe in something because a book said it. They're technically correct. You can't believe in something because a book said it. But what they're leaving out is, we're not believing in something because a book said it. It could be the Torah, it could be the Bible, it could be the Quran, it could be the Bhagavad Gita. Like which specific book is not of concern. But the idea is that we're not believing it because the book said it. We're believing it because of what the book represents and the inspiration of the book. Ultimately, it all goes back to God. That's the idea. It goes back to the superior authority. So one thing I will say, these modern arguments that they use, they're very smart in how they're worded, right? But they leave out key factors. Like if you go to the Bible, one thing communists and extreme socialists like to do is to use the terminology, money is the root of all evil. Well, that's not what the entire verse says. What does it say shortly before that? It says the love of money is the root of all evil. Do you see? This is God telling you that the love, or God inspiring people, the love of money. If you love that money, you can use that money. You can use that money to conduct your affairs, to purchase services, to purchase goods. But if you love that money, that's the problem.
People love manipulating biblical verses. My favorite is when they say, you know, he who's without sin cast the first stone, right? But they neglect the part where Jesus tells Mary Magdalene, go and sin no more, right? That's the part they forget to tell you, is that Jesus wasn't casting stones, but he was also telling her, you know, stop doing what you're doing, and you're forgiven, but stop it. They don't want to mention that part either. But I think it's really important to talk about like the reason why people believe is not because they're lost or confused or they don't know what's right or wrong unless a book tells them. It's because it's also logical. And I think this is where a lot of religious mythology does a disservice to religion, because the human brain reads these stories and we're like, this sounds ridiculous. A lot of it is mythology. A lot of it is there's a lot of human stories around religion that makes it sound like it's nothing more than fairy tales. But if you put that
What if
stuff
they're
aside,
meant to have a symbolic understanding, not necessarily a literal? I mean, if you
some of
take
it
the
is. I think
literal,
some of it is literal, some of it's symbolic.
if you
It's a little
take the
bit both.
literal and you take the extreme of it, the literal and extremely esoteric, many
Mhm.
times the truth somewhat lies in the middle.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's where people get lost, like lost in the sauce, because that was very New York of me, but whatever. Um
Yeah, that's New York language, cosmopolitan language.
it's not cosmopolitan, that's just New York. We have a lot of interesting phrases, but they get lost in that because it's easier to just write it off as a fairy tale, right? Than to look into it and say, what is it trying to convey? Why is it saying that? What was the historical context in which it says it? There's logic behind this. There's a lot of logic behind this philosophy. It's not this airy, empty, hollow belief. There's brilliant philosophy behind it. Islamic scholars, if you have you listened to some Islamic scholars, some of the most brilliant people out there, genuinely. Some of the Sufis, incredibly brilliant. Christian academics, the idea of universities, right?
Is
The,
that not a Western kind of a
in,
Western thing, the
yeah,
invention of a modern university?
yes. So we had the academia in ancient Greece. It was Plato's idea of teaching people in the that's where we get the word academics from, is from Plato. Plato's academia.
And we go back
It's
to the Greeks again.
back to the Greeks. It was this idea of teaching people, the philosophy and the understanding. And Aristotle was a student of this philosophy. But yeah, the concept of the university is a very modern concept that came from the church. A lot of knowledge came from the church, believe it or not. I mean, you see people love to use the Galileo example. They say, well, the church went after him and they silenced him, but he was correct. It was a priest who introduced the Big Bang theory. That was a priest. And we like to ignore the good things about the church, but we rail them for the horrible things. You need to have, again, you need to be balanced. You can't go into extremes. You have to look at it from both sides. uh,
There's also an argument. You bring up the Big Bang. There is an argument that the Big Bang, it's not a non-religious theory. It may be a religious theory, because the Big Bang is everything started from one point, boom, right?
right,
But
right.
what enabled that extreme condensation, or the extreme, everything, is at one point, and then it blew up and spread
Yeah,
everywhere, right? But
yeah,
what was around that? What enabled it? What was the guiding hand that enabled it
yeah,
to explode and give what we have today? It's not proven that the Big Bang theory is true, by the way. It's not proven that it's true,
yeah.
right? We still
A
don't know.
lot of
There's another theory that the universe existed forever.
Yeah, there's tons of theories out there, and ultimately nobody's gonna know for sure unless we have somebody that's been there from the very beginning, and even then we wouldn't trust them because we think they're lying. So we're not, I don't think we're ever gonna really know for sure. But religion and science don't have to be antithetical to each other. It's this idea that it's this battle. It's not. It's really not. But there's just this resistance from the secular community. There's just a resistance to allow any kind of introduction of spirituality or faith into the discussion, because it's considered mumbo jumbo. But again, an understanding of history, an understanding of philosophy, and I personally believe that an understanding of politics will lead you to conclude that it's not. There's a reason why it's there, and it's very convincing when you actually do the research. But we're in a postmodern age now. Like the postmodern philosophy is just what's taken hold. So we can get into that a little bit. I mean, how the West started eroding and trying to get rid of religion, specifically Christianity.
I'll have you talk a little bit about postmodernism, but first, just to kind of touch on our topic, how much would you say our morality, or our modern moral and ethical values are based upon the Greek philosophers? Because one thing I want to mention is, if you look at Socrates, Socrates has the triple filter test. It's attributed to Socrates. The triple filter test, or the three questions test, is that when you say something,
Mhm.
ask yourself first, is it true? And this touches to me, this touches on morality or in ethics. When you say something, is it true? Is it necessary or useful? And is it good or kind? Right? Does it pass that test? And if people were to actually follow this moral test, I believe it's a moral test. If they were to follow it, you'd have a lot less problems in society today in general, whether it's at the government level or interpersonal relations, family, friends, work, whatever. If people were able to hold themselves back from the thought, and I consider the thought to be extremely dangerous as well. I mean, you can look at the study that came out of UCLA, in which humans have, what was it, 70,000 thoughts a day or something, and that
3,000.
80% of your thoughts are negative.
Negative.
Look at how dangerous the thought is. So what Socrates is doing here, he's instilling a moral value into people. When you say something, is it true? Is it kind? Is it useful? Is it necessary? If we were to do that, you'd have a lot less problems in society today. So that's one example I want to give you about the influence of the Greeks on morality. But I would like you to go into more if you can.
Yeah, but you said something very, very interesting, is this concept of thoughts. I think, and this is just my personal opinion, and I do believe there's some religious there's some religious discussion around this as well, and credence to the concept. The idea of thought, right, of what we think is very much also rooted in the Bible. I believe it was Jesus who said, you know, if you so much as just look at somebody with lust, then you've committed adultery because you're thinking it. So it's I don't know if that's in Matthew. I'm not sure exactly where that is, but that's in the
He
Bible.
does say that. He does
He
say
does.
that.
Yeah,
If you even think about it, it's a sin.
it's a sin.
And
Yeah, because
technically he's correct. But the people that can apply that teaching are the highest of the highest, like the highest spiritual masters we have, regardless of which religion you belong. And many of the teachings of the sages, all throughout history, the religious sages, the great figures throughout all of history, they taught similar things. And Christ was definitely an inspiration to them. But when Christ is speaking about this, like, he's speaking at the highest of the high. This is the most pure of the pure.
yeah,
What segment of the public today can follow that? 0.1%?
maybe less. I think it's also it's interesting because, you know, there's I don't know if I'm going to butcher this phrase, but I've heard it before and I have to look this up, but it's the idea that your thoughts become your words become your actions become your behavior becomes your character. And so it all comes from your thoughts. What's really interesting is the word logic, right? The word logic, people think it's the humans are a rational species. We're supposed to be a rational species. What distinguishes us is our concept, our ability for logic. The word logic comes from logos, and logos is also a Greek word that's used interchangeably with the Christ. So the idea is that logic comes from God. Reason and order comes from God.
Or the word. Yeah.
And hence, made in the image of God, we have the capability for logic.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Which brings us closer to the divine. And I think that's something we when we start behaving in a way that trades the divinity of the gift of human logic, we trade that away and reduce ourselves to just animalistic instincts, which is what society is about now. It's very hedonistic culture right now. This culture is very much giving into pleasure and giving into notions that there's no bigger purpose. Once you do that, right, you're reducing what it means to be a human, really.
Yeah.
And that's what we are.
And as you're mentioning, what separates us as humans from the animals is our free will. It is essentially our free will. You know, I'll share with you a quote from the Imam Ali, and a quote from the Islamic side. He stated once that God created the angels with intellect and no desire, and God created the animals with desire, no intellect, and God created the children of Adam with intellect and with desire. Those whose intellect control their desire are better than the angels, and those whose desire control their intellect are worse than the animals. This is a moral statement. This is a statement of morality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that doesn't mean much to people in modern culture who've grown up in secularism, which says there's nothing beyond this. It's just live your life and maximize your happiness, and there's no other greater purpose. This, you see, when we're having this discussion, a lot of this is going to be written off as ridiculous. But again, you really need to sit. People study their entire lives to really grasp these concepts. And it's one of those things where if you're a doctor and you go to med school, right? And you get that degree, how are you going to explain and condense all your learning to somebody in 30 minutes? We're having this conversation. I don't know if it's been 30 minutes or not. How are you going to condense that all? Similarly, how do you condense centuries of philosophy and centuries of religion and convince somebody of the truth of it if they're not even willing to have that conversation?
And these
So
figures study, these figures that we're referring to, I mean, their entire lives, their entire ministry
yeah,
is focused on these types of questions.
right. And I think what we're seeing now, I think, is it's very much a culture that it's forgotten its roots. I think the
Do
Western
you,
culture has forgotten its roots.
when you're studying law, do you study the influence of the Greeks?
Not directly, but if you have a understanding, if you have a background in philosophy, you see it in the law. If you don't, to you, it's just the law. But if
What
you have an
percent?
understanding in the philosophy, it's always there. I can't think of a single class. There's not one where we sat down and we didn't see some kind of philosophy. I mean, in torts. So torts is the concept of righting a wrong or an injury against a person in a civil court, right? It's like if somebody, have you heard of those like slip and fall cases? That's a torts case. So it's the idea that you know, you can remedy somebody and make them whole financially. Whatever you're going to get compensation or whatever. In torts, there's a concept of, it drives everybody crazy. It's the concept of the reasonable person, right? If you read what this the standard for this reasonable person, if you dive into like what's the concept of this reasonable person, it sounds very, very similar to the ideal man in Greek philosophy, very much so.
The
um
ideal man.
the ideal man. So Greek philosophy has this concept of an ideal person. I believe, I have to look this up, it might be Socrates or Plato. It's the concept of the ideal person is the one you have to strive to. You have to strive to become, again,
To
he
become like the ideal person or the
become like the
perfect
ideal
man.
person. It's the one who lives with virtue.
Yeah.
So again, that's in the law. We hold people to that standard. We hold people to the reasonable person standard, the idea of one who lives with the virtue. You know, in almost every philosophy, it's every legal concept, it's there. There's something that's rooted in an ancient philosophy. And again, you know, you can't go into a Islamic country, or specifically more so like the ones that I'm not speaking about the Wahhabism, but more like the Sharia countries along the lines of like Islamic law. Their philosophy and their law is rooted in their religion. So you can't have a government that's not rooted in some kind of ultimate understanding of what keeps the world in order. You can't. It just doesn't exist. So and if you try to do it, then you're becoming your own god, and you're creating a society that's entirely subjective in its laws.
And that's where humanity fails. It's when they start to play God. And this is a very dangerous area that
Yeah.
modern society, you know, the secular agenda is in danger of reaching. Like they are playing God.
Yeah. Yeah. So my question to you, Sid, is you're a couple of years, not too much older than me, but a couple of years older than me. What did you see this transformation happen? Because when I was a kid, it's always been there, and I remember being younger and having kind of like an understanding of a world that was based in some kind of morality. But I think it was during my middle school years that started to go away, and it just became obvious that there wasn't anything. So I don't really remember what the world was like. You know, I'm
There's been
considered,
a change.
yeah, there's been a
There's
change,
been
I
a
think,
change. I was
from,
born in the 80s. Yeah, I was born in the 80s. In my teenage years, it was the 90s. And there has been a dramatic change. I mean, even in the 90s, growing up, most of my friends had stable families. All my friends from all cultures had stable families. They had a mom and dad at home. They had big families. They would hang out with their, you know, everyone had cousins that they hung out with. It was very much very normal to me. And that has changed dramatically in the past 20 years. Family values are no longer important. Truth is no longer important, even though it's claimed to be important. Today you have this, they call it, you know, the woke agenda. Um, Everything has changed. Everything is upside down. Morality is under attack. Godly values are under attack, and you see it everywhere. You see it everywhere. I mean, today they have the concept of medical assistance in death, where I
Yeah, I've
mean,
been hearing about that for Canada.
yeah, like
Yeah.
if you're like it pretty
Have you
much
tried?
sounds like if you want to
Yeah.
die, the government will
Yeah.
will execute you. And this is something that's haram, we use in our terminology. Like
I
this
saw a
is
funny
wrong.
meme. I
But
saw a funny meme about
I
in
want to
not
add this.
yeah, yeah,
Let
but
me
just
just
quickly.
go ahead.
Go for it. But it's just a funny meme that was about this because I didn't know this was happening in Canada, but I saw a meme that was like somebody goes like, "Hey, I broke a leg. Can I go to the hospital?" And in the UK, it's like, "Sure, you have an appointment in 3 months." And in America, it's like that. Yeah, that'll be like $12,000. And then in Canada, it's like, "Have you considered dying?"
Oh my God. Wow.
It's
So
really
so like if you just think about basic things, like I look at things from a spiritual perspective,
Mhm.
and I do believe that human beings, if they're left alone and raised in a moral society, they will on their own tend, as they get older, they will tend to become wiser. They will tend to be more interested in God, because as you're getting older, you're also getting closer to death. You know, your cells start dying off. You start thinking about your morality. You start
yeah,
thinking about truth. You start thinking about
purpose.
what's out there. So
Yeah,
this medically assisted dying thing, just a random example. You
yeah,
don't choose when you're born as a human being. You don't choose how you're born. You don't choose the moment that you're born. Similarly, as a human being, you should not be choosing the moment of your death. I mean, life makes sense. It works in cycles. You don't decide when you're born, thus you don't decide when you die. You leave that in God's hands, right?
yeah,
That's how I view things, from our values are rooted
yeah. But
in
we have something different now. We have something called consent culture, which is this idea that you have to consent to everything that's happening to you. So you have people suing their parents for being born. You have people trying to stop puberty
no
because,
way.
yeah, you didn't hear about that guy from,
No.
yeah, but it's not as big. It's not the biggest thing. It's just an
Someone's
example.
actually suing their parents for being born.
Yeah, they were like, I didn't consent to this. It's this idea that everything that happens to you, you have to agree to. But in reality, that's not. Again,
It's not
you're
realistic. Yeah.
having again. The Greeks would say you're over your excess of pride because who are you to decide what's going to happen? There are things in this world that are out of your control. That's why you're seeing a lot of people are just like postponing puberty because they're not consenting to it. I'm sure if you read about that, or this idea of if you're going to medically assisted suicide is this idea of death is going to happen when I consent to it. It's consent culture gone to an extreme. And once again, we need a balance. There are some things you have to accept. They just are what they are. But
Do you feel the
yeah,
pendulum swinging the other way? Because you have a change today. You have the mainstream media losing its power. I see, it's dying, and the mainstream media is like kind of, it's trapped in the corner. You trap
yeah,
in the corner, it's going to be wild, it's going to be reactionary, it's going to fight with every last to its last breath. So you
I
have the rise of alternative media, such as in social media. You have the rise of the Ben Shapiro's, the Jordan Petersons, the Matt Walsh, all these. They're like, a lot of people are
Candace
coming up as like
Owens,
Candace Owens, modern day philosophers. And I believe in 10, 20 years the mainstream media may no longer even exist, or it's going
yep.
to be this complete shell of its former self. So I do see the pendulum swinging the other way. What do you think about that?
I believe in 10 or 20 years, the Ben Shapiro's are going to be mainstream because pendulum's always swinging. We had a couple of years where it was, the Anderson Coopers and the Chris Hayes and the Rachel Maddows were the mainstream. It's swinging now. It's swinging because people are. That's just how humans are. They're just reactionary. But look, I'm a prime demographic for this ideology. My parents are both immigrants. I'm a woman. I grew up in New York City with speaking 3 different languages in a neighborhood that's extremely diverse. I'm ripe for like woke ideology. But at the end of the day, a lot of people, especially as a lot of people my age, like we're getting older and we're seeing that it's not bearing any positive fruit for us. It's not it's not logical, it's not bearing. It's great when you're young because it's so fancy, it's idealistic, it sounds wonderful, but then you see and you read and if you really expose yourself to this. And this is not just this idea that people get more conservative as they get older, it's they get wiser as they get older. and they realized, the truth for the lies. I think Winston Churchill says, if you're young and you're not a liberal, you have no heart. But if you're older and you're not a conservative, you have no brain. So it's
That's
something
very
that,
interesting.
yeah, yeah.
I guess you can get some good quotes out of someone who many people look at as actually not a very great man, and society may one day show Winston Churchill as, you know, not one of the greatest figures
Okay,
that
well, that's the
ever
thing
lived.
there's a lot of people that hate him, but again, he did some good things. People don't want to, like, he did some great things for the country. He got the country out of a horrible time. But that what you just said is very much, this is the conflict we're in right now. We're seeing the same reaction to the founding fathers, where their statues are getting taken down. I was just in Virginia. There's an avenue or a street. It's called Monument Road or something like that. They're all gone. They've all been taken down
So they're
because
destroying what the United States was founded upon. So the United States was founded upon these figures. The thing with Winston Churchill is that the United Kingdom was not founded upon him. He came later. But you
no,
look
it
at the
wasn't.
United States, they were founded
Yeah.
up, like these figures founded it.
Well, yeah, just to play devil's advocate here, but you could also argue that he saved it. So there's also that, right?
Yeah.
Because what Churchill did, I mean, I think it's also remarkable
I
that the
mean, the
Queen.
quote you said by Winston Churchill, it's actually an excellent quote.
Yeah. Look, I'm Arab American. I'm not going to sit here and say the guy was great. Like, he did some horrible things for our people, but he also did some great things for his people.
Yeah.
So again, he saved the culture in many ways, and I think you need to be balanced. You need to look at people for what they are, which is complex. Nobody's good or bad in that sense. They're complex beings. Thomas Jefferson, the guy had slaves, and that's an unforgivable thing, right? The guy was also very much anti-slavery. So how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile, the philosophies that he gave us in this country, which a lot of them are the roots of this country, and very much are the basis of the way we structure things. How do you reconcile, the good and the bad? You can't go into extremes. You have to see them for it's kind of like your parents when you're kids, they're superheroes, and then when you get older, like, you can't stand them, and then when you're an adult, you realize they're complex beings just like you.
Just like
So
you.
there's that, and I think, again, we need balance when we speak about people. We really do, except for the ones that are obvious cases that are just like, okay, this one,
Yeah,
clearly was on something, or
yeah.
yeah.
Just to round things out, because we're talking about morality and moral values. What percentage of the moral values that we hold sacred today would you say are derived from either religion or Greek philosophy?
I don't think I'm an authority to give a figure like that. I don't know. Personally,
Would you say it's over 50% of our
I would
moral
personally,
values?
I would say it's over 50%. Yeah,
Would you
I
say
would say,
it's over 80?
I think 80 would be a good number. Personally, I wouldn't say it's 100, but again, I'm not
Something
an,
to think about.
yeah, yeah, it's something to think about. I'm not an authority to give that figure. And I don't think I'm credible enough to give you like that estimate. It would just be pure opinion, but I do think a substantial amount, more than a majority.
Yeah. But you are smart enough to give an opinion. And
Mhm.
your answer on this is going to coincide with many people are probably going to give a very similar answer when it comes to this
Well,
question.
I thank you. I mean, I hope I'm smart enough to give an opinion, but we have a lot of people that are giving out opinions, and it's not best reflection of their intelligence. So I hope that I didn't make a fool of myself here, but
No, no, you didn't. But I want to ask you, before we go, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about postmodernism. I remember when I was taking political science and they kept bringing up these terms. They'd bring up all these terms, and then I'd ask myself, like, postmodernism, the deconstruction of what we know and words and languages. And I'm like, like these who has time to sit there and come up with these terms and these ideas for everything? It almost seems like a distraction. Can you talk a little bit about postmodernism
yeah,
and
I mean,
deconstruction?
you have to look at it in terms of what field are you referring to. I mean, the artistic field, when you go and you see somebody putting a
Politics.
banana up on the wall, or okay, political postmodernism is something, it's a little different. It's the idea that it's centered on, so there was a modernist movement, which was like the kind of like challenging, deconstructing, and the postmodernist movement is just it's skepticism to the point where you are
No longer rooted in anything.
it's subjective. You're not rooted in anything. It's a very subjective philosophy.
Isn't that dangerous?
I think it's dangerous because it's what are you really grounded in?
Wouldn't that change our concept of morality? Because if you're not anchored to anything, like if you're not like if a ship is not anchored, if you're not anchored to anything, you're not stable.
Right.
I mean, you're gonna go wherever the winds go. Is that not a danger to humanity?
I think it is. I mean, some people think postmodernism is the greatest thing that's ever happened because it's defined most of the last 100 years, or rather, it's been trying to define it because there has been a conflict. I mean, it really depends. It's this idea of like, it's the idea of subjectivism. Subjectivism is the root of all things, and this is the problem. The reason why I see it as a religious question is because when you're looking at a subjective philosophy, what you're doing is you're essentially saying each man is his own god, right? The ego is the god. And I think that at the end of the day, what you're essentially giving into is the concept of your lower being the one who dictates what's truth and what's not. I mean, if you're looking at reality and you're questioning, like, if a cup of water is in front of you and you're thinking, how do I know this is a cup of water? It's a very easy way to go insane. And a lot of these philosophers did go insane, So
and
I
the
mean,
ego
is a whole other discussion we can get into. It's very deep, and there's a lot of
ego is the ultimate enemy. But the reason why I bring up that talk about postmodernism is because if your moral values are based on something solid, absolute, postmodernism has this idea of deconstructing things. If you deconstruct everything, what are your moral values based on going forward? So
yeah.
So my second last question for you.
Oh boy.
What does it mean?
A little smirk. I don't know.
What does it mean to you to be traditional despite all the changes that we're seeing today?
It means to have a strong backbone because the whole culture is telling you to go one way, and you have to be confident in yourself to say, no, I'm not going to go in that direction. It means I think it's a testament of your character, really, at the end of the day. It's, again, I go back to the vaccine thing. I think the people who refuse to take the vaccine are some of the strongest people on this planet right now, because it was the pressure tactics were so insane for somebody to resist it and not allow their psychology to fall into what happened, and to have that psychological fortitude. I think that's incredibly, incredibly strong. So I think what it means to me right now is it means the ability to stand firm in your convictions, not be easily influenced, and essentially really be a fighter just by living an average life. That's what I think.
I guarantee you 20, 30 years from now, 100 years from now, the future historians that write the history of this period, everything that happened with COVID is going to be looked upon very negatively.
I agree. And I said that in the middle of the pandemic. I said that I didn't say it 2 weeks in the pandemic, because I did go for the 2 weeks thing. I was like, all right, let's give it a shot. After that, I was off board. But I said that in the beginning, towards in the middle, and then towards the end, I was screaming it. Nobody wanted to hear it. So I shut up about it, because it's for me. And I said this to many people that are no longer in my life, but I said, this is going to be another Iraq war. Right now, everybody's jumping down someone's throat who said something about it. 10 years from now, you're all going to agree that we were right.
Yeah. Just like right now, most people on the right and left know that the Iraq war was a horrible idea. Traditionally, it has been the left-wing people that have said, these wars are a bad idea, because the right wing was under control of warmongers. But with the emergence of Donald Trump in 2016, now you have this very strong, I mean, even before him, Ron Paul, the strong anti-war sentiment that has seeped into what's becoming the new mainstream of the right.
Right. But people forget, right now it's easier to say the Iraq war was a mistake. You couldn't say that in 2002. You couldn't say that in 2003. You couldn't say that in 2004.
Well, I was saying that in 2003.
Yeah. When did we go into I'm sorry. I was really young for that. When did that war start?
That was 2003. And most of it was
2003.
Most of the Arabs were against the war.
But you couldn't say anything about what the United States was doing at the time, even in 2000.
But
You
there
couldn't-
were massive protests, Nadia. There were
Yeah.
the biggest protests ever, anti-war protests were taking place, and it was known about. But the mainstream coverage was, let's go to war, right?
Right, exactly. And it was unpopular, it was anti-American. People got canceled left and right. Look what happened to the Dixie Chicks, right?
Yes, yes.
So
People were canceled. Yeah.
people were canceled left and right. So that's what again, we didn't learn our lesson because we did the same thing during COVID, but I'm confident couple of months, I don't even think it's going to be years. I think it's a couple of months because we're seeing it already. People are going to realize, except for a handful of
It
those
may
who are
happen
still in
sooner.
their little bubbles. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So my last question.
You said that last time.
No, that was my second last question.
Okay.
My last question. Did you have fun?
Yeah, that was awesome. I will admit though, I wish I was a little more on my game because I'm running on I think 3 hours of sleep. So I'm a little bit, you know, off, but I hope I made sense and it was coherent. If I watch this again and I'm slurring, then I'll know.
No, no, no. You made total sense, and you did a wonderful job.
Well, thank you for having me. I really am excited about this podcast that you're starting. What do you think the next episode's going to be on?
I still haven't decided. I do have some ideas in mind, but I would like to have you on definitely as a future
You should do a
guest.
conspiracies episode.
Who knows? Maybe we'll get into that one day.
Yeah, don't be generic and talk about the moon landing. Talk about something fun like the
Yeah.
Titanic. That's a great one.
I never talk about the moon landing. I think that theory is a bunch of nonsense. We did go to the moon.
I think about it. I don't know. I'm open to it. We should discuss flat Earth now. That'll be funny.
Yeah, that's another thing. Our Earth is round. I don't know what's gotten into people.
I don't know.
I don't know how you can believe in that, but
I don't understand.
That's a subject for another day.
I like to do this thing when I meet people when they talk about conspiracies. I like to do this thing and pick out the most outlandish one. So I always go for flat Earth. But lately I've been going for Italy isn't a real country. It was created by Disney to promote the movie Luca. So
I've
that's the
never
one
heard
I've
of
been
that.
going with lately because it's a lot of fun. It's
I've
just
never heard of that.
just watch people's faces when you like really believe what you're saying. It's so much fun. Anyway,
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Nadia. Hopefully we'll have you on in the future as well.
yeah, I hope you got many more episodes to come.
Okay, and I really appreciated our conversation today. Have a
Like
wonderful day.
you too. Bye.
Okay, thank you.